Hi, everyone. My name is Christy Statz, and thank you so much for being with us today. I do some mobilizing with the Evangelical Immigration Table, and today we are going to be talking about dreamers in Pennsylvania, and really across the country, not just Pennsylvania, but in Pennsylvania, and how the church can care well for them. Our run of show today, we're going to get to hear from Ivana Lopez Espinoza, who is a dreamer who grew up in PA, if I can speak today. And then we're going to hear from Matthew Sorens from World Relief. At the very end, we're going to have a time of question and answer. So stick around and feel free to ask either of them some of your questions. And for those who ask, yes, today's session will be recorded and you are welcome to share it around with your friends, your community, your small groups, your church. And we would really, really love you to consider one of the big asks we're going to have for you today is that after this call, after this webinar, that you would contact your two senators, Senator Casey and Senator Toomey, and ask them on behalf of Dreamers to pass a DREAM Act. And so we will have a really easy way for you to do that. So anyways, without further ado, I would like to invite Ivana to come join me. She can turn her mic and her video on. Welcome, Ivana.
Hi.
Ivana is the new DEI manager of the Mathey Botanical Gardens and Nichols Arboretum at the University of Michigan. She's just finished her master's there in higher education with a concentration in diversity and social justice. Before that, she got her BA in sociology at Gettysburg College, and she went to Gettysburg Area High School, class of 2016. Ivana, it's such a joy. Where exactly did you grow up? Did you grow up in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania?
Yes, I grew up right in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania.
That's great. And for those who don't know where Gettysburg is, what would be its closest bigger city?
DC. So it's like on the south central border of Pennsylvania. So down here.
There you go. Okay. I think everyone should know, but just in case. Well, thank you so much for sharing a little bit about your journey. I would love you to tell our audience, what was it like growing up undocumented?
Yeah, thank you for the first question. Growing up undocumented was very interesting. A lot of the times there was more challenges, at least for myself, being an undocumented youth. My parents and I immigrated to the United States 20 years ago this year. So I was 3 years old when we crossed the border. So I was constantly worried about the uncertainty of like losing my parents. And also high school was tough, especially during the application process to college, because I was super excited about the opportunity to further my education and continue my studies. However, my status really presented a lot of barriers because it wasn't only preventing me from submitting applications and being able to qualify from financial aid, but also our financial status really limited the schools that I could apply to and where I could go.
And did your wider community know that you were undocumented, or did you feel like you had to keep that a secret?
In high school, no one really knew I was undocumented. There were a few people who were undocumented and a part of that community that did know my status. But a lot of the times I did pass as having some type of status. And so folks really didn't grow up, and I became more comfortable speaking about my identity once I graduated high school. And I was really able to understand what it meant to be undocumented. And I felt comfortable and safe sharing my story.
Now, we're going to talk about something called DACA, and it's had a huge benefit on your life. But I know that there's some people, as they're listening to this, they won't know what DACA is. And so could you explain what DACA is and then how it has benefited you?
Yeah, so DACA is short for the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which was enacted in 2012. And this is an opportunity to grant certain individuals Social Security number as well as deferred action from deportation. And so in order to qualify for DACA, you have to meet certain qualifications, such as being certain age requirements, and then as well as not having any type of legal record. And so DACA to me has been very beneficial, and I was able to qualify when I was in high school. In 2015, I was able to apply And it was really beneficial for me to be able to, one, have a social security number to be able to submit applications, because even though I don't qualify for FAFSA, institutions do require some type of documentation regarding your own financial status. And so with having a social security number, I was able to apply for that, as well as other scholarship opportunities that aren't really afforded to folks that don't have citizenship status.
That's really helpful. So it just had a huge impact on your life.
Yeah, it really has. It's helped me continue my education. And so I feel a lot safer being able to travel. So leaving Pennsylvania, now being in Michigan, and being able to go back and forth.
So tell me about your passion for education, and how has that been complemented by obviously being able to go to more education?
My passion for education really starts off when I joined kindergarten. My parents dropped me off, and right as I came back, I wanted to pack a bag and just stay there. I just thought it was so fun. I loved the toys and everything. But honestly, education was just a passion for me, as I was confused a lot of the time growing up. K-12 was challenging, especially growing up undocumented, because you get mixed signals of like opportunities, such as being able to study abroad. I had the opportunity to speak German, and so I have continued to study German since I was 7. However, when opportunities came to, go to Germany, I wasn't able to do that just because of my own status.
So that's something I think a lot of people might not realize. So there's some terms that we sometimes mix around. And for those who don't know, so dreamers would be the general category we call people like yourself who have been here since they were very young and been in an undocumented position with their legal status. And then DACA was the legal provision that was created that was 2012, right?
Yes.
It enabled certain members of the dreamer population to be able to apply and be able to get a driver's license and go to school, but you still can't leave the country. So that has a big impact. So you can't visit Germany and practice your German. Can you visit Mexico and visit family?
No. So if I choose to leave the country, I have to apply for advanced parole, which is a costly application. It's about an additional $500 to $700 that you do have to apply with your DACA. And you can only apply for work purposes, educational purposes, or emergency family reasons. But you have to have the money to be able to apply, and also have the money to fund your trips. And so while it is feasible, it is challenging to be able to qualify for advanced parole.
Yeah. And so I think for folks to hear that, I just don't think that that's a consideration that, many folks who aren't undocumented have thought about. And so it hinders, being able to go see relatives, and as well as, opportunities like language practice. Thanks for clarifying that. So how have you seen DACA advancing your career and future? And what would it mean if we can move from DACA to, we talk about this thing called a DREAM Act, like actually passing a permanent way for you to stay here? What would those combination, like how has DACA now helped advance your future? And then what would a DREAM Act mean to dreamers such as yourself?
Yeah, so DACA right now has benefited me in my education, and being able to provide me access to different institutions such as the University of Michigan, and now I'm employed by them. And so I have a more sense of financial security than I did growing up. So through that, I'm able to support my parents a little bit more, where I couldn't do that growing up. And so passing the DREAM Act and incorporating all just like undocumented youth and adults would not only provide more financial security for me, but also just family security. I wouldn't have to worry about my parents being deported. I'd be able to watch them travel freely and also go back home and see their family. I know in my case, both of my grandmothers have passed away, and I unfortunately didn't have the opportunity to build that relationship with them, or even get to know them, or visit during their services. And so being able to pass this is super beneficial to my future, my career, because it'll allow me to then, if I potentially want to pursue a doctorate, pursue different programs that might not just be in the United States, but might be able to be outside. And ultimately being able to come back into the United States and make sure that we're building a better and more improved higher education.
That's wonderful. I appreciate that. Well, Ivana, thank you so much for sharing some of your story. We'll bring you back on here later for Q&A. But we are going to transition right now. Ivana will leave us in Matthew Sorens, who is the head of church mobilization with World Relief. Let's see if I can get this right. Matt also coordinates, he's the national coordinator for the Evangelical Immigration Table. And I always get your books wrong. He's co-authored Welcoming the Stranger, and I have like 20 copies in my office that I hand out like candy, with Jenny Yang. And he has also authored, is it Seeking Refuge on the Shores of the Global Refugee Crisis, which is a very appropriate book to read as of what's happened in the last week with Afghanistan, everyone thinking about refugees. And so Matt is going to talk today about kind of some of the big picture stuff around Dreamers and DACA, and also give you a framework for thinking more biblically about this subject. I know it's easy for us to think about this in the realm of politics, but as Christians, we really want to engage with scripture. So Matt, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christy. I'm going to just share a few slides so you don't have to look at me this whole time. Let's see. You think, a year and a half into a pandemic, I'd have figured out how to do this. There we go. First of all, thank you, Ivana, for sharing your story. It's just so powerful. And I think an important reminder that, these issues are political issues, but ultimately they're about people who, for those of us who are Christians, are people made in God's image, whom we are called to honor the dignity of each person. That's kind of what I want to focus on. First of all, just to give it'll be a little repetitive with what Ivana shared, but just make sure we're clear on some of the terms and the history of Dreamers and DACA and how do these things fit together. And then look a little bit at, well, how do we think about these issues for those of us who are Christians as we think about what the Bible says? And then maybe close with some ideas about how we can respond to the current situation. So let's see. So just in terms of terms, as Ivana said, Dreamers is sort of an umbrella term for individuals who don't have current legal status, who were brought to the United States as children. So many of those people could still be children, but more often than not, they have since, turned 18 and are now adults. In fact, many Dreamers are in their 30s now. Some of them, are married and have their own children. So it's sometimes we hear about Dreamer kids, but that's a little bit of a misnomer because, of course, people don't stay children, but it's people who entered as children in the United States. And obviously, part of the dynamic there is, if you come here as a 4-year-old, you usually didn't make the decision to come here. And that was usually, if your parents decided to bring you along, whether that was overstaying a temporary visa or crossing the border. And I think because of that dynamic, there has long been efforts in the U.S. Congress to pass legislation that would provide a remedy for individuals who are in that circumstance of having been brought as children to the United States and lacking legal status. In fact, the first version of that was called the DREAM Act. That's where that term dreamer actually comes from. It was introduced back in 2001, a bipartisan bill. I think it was Senator Hatch from Utah, Republican, Senator Durbin from Illinois, where I'm actually based, who's a Democrat. And unfortunately, from my perspective, that bill didn't pass in 2001. And it's been reintroduced nearly every Congress since for a couple decades now. And it has never passed both the House of Representatives and the US Senate and then been signed into law by the president. So the DREAM Act is at this moment not law. I think it was the major provision of the DREAM Act. It basically would have said, if you're here unlawfully, but you were brought here before your 16th birthday, and of course, if you can, pass a basic criminal background check, you'd be eligible for temporary legal status. And with that, you'd have to prove that you completed either 2 years of college or 2 years of military service. And with that, you could apply for permanent legal status and eventually then citizenship. So that was the original DREAM Act going back to 2001. And there's been different versions of it with slight variations on who qualifies. But it was after the DREAM Act failed in the US Senate. It passed the US House of Representatives, but then failed in the US Senate in 2010, that the Obama administration created DACA, which, as we heard, stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. So the idea of deferred action is not a new element of our immigration laws. In fact, every administration for several decades has used a deferred action, but it's basically it's based on the idea of prosecutorial discretion, which is to say, there are 11 million immigrants living without legal status in the United States. Technically, they're all deportable under the law. But the US government doesn't have, and the Congress has not appropriated resources to deport all of those people. So any administration is going to need to have some element of prioritization. So for the Obama administration, they basically said, our high priorities are people with serious criminal convictions, recent entrants to try to be a deterrent to people to come. Of course, anyone with like a terrorism concern or something like that. But then if you have your high priorities, inherently you have to have your low priorities. And deferred action basically said, you're our lowest priority. If you were brought here as a child, you're in high school, excuse me, or you finished school and you don't have any serious criminal issues, we're going to defer action on removing you from the country. And with that, the administration was allowed to give individuals work authorization, which allows them to get a valid social security number, that allows you to get a job. Excuse me. In most places, that allowed you to go get a driver's license. So it allows you to have a mostly normal life, with the caveat that DACA provision and the work authorization was valid for 2 years and then had to be renewed every 2 years. It's also worth noting that DACA doesn't qualify you, for example, for federal financial aid. So it's not as good as citizenship. It doesn't give you all the benefits of citizenship. It doesn't allow you to vote, but it does allow you to have a sense of security, at least on 2-year increments, and to be able to work. And for hundreds of thousands, at the moment, there's about 650,000 individuals who currently benefit from DACA. It has really been life transformational. But there's also challenges with DACA. And first of all, it doesn't apply to everyone who'd be in that larger category of dreamer for a few reasons. So again, these are the rules that were set back in 2012 when the Obama administration created DACA. You had to have been present at the time it was announced 5 years earlier, so June 15th, 2007, which applied to the vast majority of dreamers almost 10 years ago in 2012 when it was created. But at this point, there's a lot of people who maybe entered in 2008 who have been here most of their lives, who were brought as small children, who wouldn't qualify for DACA. You also have to have entered before you turn 16. You have to have been you have to be 15 years old to submit your application in most cases for DACA. You must either be in school or have completed high school in the United States. Of course, there are restrictions for people with serious criminal issues, and then you have to pay a filing fee and undergo a criminal background check. And then for those who are granted DACA, there's a renewal process every 2 years. This was put in place in 2012. It was in place for a number of years. And then, as many of you will remember, back in September of 2017, the Trump administration announced that it was intending to terminate DACA. They gave kind of a few months of a wind down period, at which point people, if had their plans gone as they intended, would have lost their work authorization and would have lost their legal protection. So it doesn't necessarily mean that hundreds of thousands of people would have been deported, but that was a possibility under the law. It also immediately restricted all new applications for DACA back in September 2017. Well, that, as you might predict and maybe remember, was challenged in the courts, and it went back and forth in the courts. The status quo for a number of years was that there were still no new applications for DACA allowed, but individuals who already had DACA could continue to renew it every 2 years, allowing them to keep their jobs and continue to support their families. And that culminated with a Supreme Court decision last summer in June of 2020. The Supreme Court did not rule on the legality of DACA. And I think that's important because some of the news coverage people maybe simplistically heard as the Supreme Court says DACA is here for good. And that's not necessarily what the Supreme Court said. What the Supreme Court did say was that the procedure by which the Trump administration sought to end DACA did not follow all the right procedural rules. So the Supreme Court kept DACA in place against the Trump administration's wishes for that moment. And then a subsequent court order clarified that not only did they have to keep it open for those who already had DACA, but they had to reopen the program. And they did that in last December, so less than a year ago. That was really important because you had all these people who had not yet turned 15 years old when DACA was, when the DACA applications closed back in 2017. Many of those people applied in December and January and February. And for most of those applications, and for what we know, there's about 80,000 pending applications. USCIS, which is the part of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security that adjudicates DACA applications, has been frankly very slow. And I think they would say that they were understaffed at the beginning of the new administration. But just a couple months ago, in July 2020, another court decision occurred. This was Judge Andrew Hanen in Texas, and he ruled that the Obama administration had actually not followed the right process when they created DACA. So he's ruled that DACA is illegal. Now, he also stayed the effect of his order for those who currently have DACA. So for individuals who presently have DACA, they haven't lost their work authorization. However, no new applications are allowed, and pending cases, those 80,000 or so that had, in many cases been submitted by people who turned 15 just in the last few years, those cannot be approved at this point until such time as a higher court would rule and say that the lower court got it wrong. But it is very likely that this decision will also end up in the Supreme Court. And there's some reason to be, from my perspective, pessimistic about what will happen there. So all of this underscores that as much as I think the intentions of DACA were good, and it certainly has had an important impact for a lot of young people, including a lot of young people within our churches, it's not a permanent solution because only Congress can do that. An administration cannot do that. And only the Congress can pass a law that is clearly legal and that will avoid further court challenges. So I want to get to how Congress does that, but I want to take a step back and just talk biblically. How do we think about these issues for those of us who are Christians? First of all, just the Bible has so much to say about God's love for immigrants, or the word in the Hebrew that in English gets translated either as foreigner or immigrant, sojourner, stranger, alien. It's the word ger. And it appears 92 times in the Hebrew scriptures in the Old Testament. It's actually a very frequent theme. And in many of those instances, it's God telling the people of Israel, when a foreigner resides with you in your land, you shall not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you shall be to you as your native born. You shall love them as yourselves. Often that was based in the people of Israel's own experience as foreigners who were mistreated in the land of Egypt, which I think for Americans ought to resonate because most Americans have a history of immigration as well, of someone in our ancestry who crossed a border in the United States, whether as an immigrant, coming through on the Mayflower or in Dallas Island, or in a form of forced migration and on a slave ship, or into Angel Island on the West Coast, as many Chinese immigrants came in, or across the border into JFK Airport. However we came, most of us have those histories. And I think the challenge of God to the people of Israel should resonate with us as well, which is to basically remember that you yourselves were once immigrants and allow that to inform how you treat those who come as immigrants after you. And God often mentions the immigrant, the foreigner, right alongside the orphan and the widow as people who were uniquely vulnerable and in need of the welcome of a community and the support of the broader community. Again, I listed a few of those passages here in Psalm 146, and Zechariah 7, and Malachi 3. Another theme biblically is just that God commands his people to hospitality. And I think sometimes we misunderstand hospitality. We think of hospitality as like having our friends over for lunch. But in reality, hospitality in the Greek of the New Testament is the word philoxenia. It is literally the love of strangers. And that's not a suggestion, it's a command. It's something that all Christians are called to. And of course, dreamers they're only, they're not strangers in that they have been in our country in many cases for 10, 15, 20, 30 years. They're often very much culturally a part of the United States, that they've grown up here. But that command, I think, broadly to how we think about immigrants is a command to love and to treat them as we would want to be treated as well. And then the unique dynamic of dreamers, of course, is that they come as children. And if there's one group of people that Jesus has some very strong words for, it's those who would cause children to stumble. We see that in Matthew 18. So I think it's really incumbent upon us as Christians to do all that we can to remove the barriers that are keeping these young people who came as children from flourishing in our society. And that's not only for their sake, although many of them are, people whom we know who are sisters and brothers in Christ, who are part of our congregations, but it's also for the sake of our society as a whole. Dreamers are contributing in incredible ways at an economic level, at a societal level. Obviously, Ivana is a great example of that, but also not an entirely unique example of that. And all of that is rooted in this reality that dreamers, like every immigrant and frankly, like every human person, are made in the image of God with inherent dignity and with potential. We're made in the image of a creator God. And that means that each dreamer, like everyone else, has the potential to create and to contribute. And we see that when you look at the economic contributions of dreamers. I think sometimes people will ask the question, well, what would this cost the United States? First of all, these are people who are already here. So if anything, it's allowing them to pay more in taxes by having more higher incomes, using the talents and skills that God has given them and that they've developed through education. So it's a net win for the United States. But at the end of the day, our concern for dreamers, just like for other immigrants, is rooted in the idea that these are people made in the image of God, who reflect his image and who have inherent dignity. So that's thinking a little bit biblically about this idea of dreamers, but I also think we want to think biblically about how do we respond, which as Christy said, one of the core responses right now is really advocacy, because at World Relief, where I work, we do legal services. We do our very best with that. We do lots of other services that dreamers or other immigrants can benefit from. But what we can't do as an organization is make someone citizenship. I mean, we can help people apply for citizenship, but if they don't qualify under US law, there's nothing we can do there. And that would require Congress and the president to make some changes. So that's something that we've advocated for at World Relief and with our partners at the Evangelical Immigration Table for many years. And there's biblical reasons we think that sort of advocacy is important. One goes to Romans chapter 13, where we're instructed to be subject to the governing authorities. And of course, that passage often comes up in the context of immigration as we think about, well, how do we think about someone who's not currently lawfully in the country? And those are fair conversations to have, but Romans 13 also speaks to those of us who are citizens, because if we're subject to the governing authorities in our democratic form of government, we are invited to speak into the policymaking process. So whether that's making a phone call to your member of Congress or your senator's office, sending a letter, going and meeting with them, that's part of what we're expected to do in a democratic form of government. And we also have lots of examples in the scriptures of some of the heroes of our faith going before governmental leaders in position of authority to advocate for justice, to advocate for those who are vulnerable. So for example, you see that with Moses going before Pharaoh and pleading for the people of Israel who were enslaved. You see it with Esther, who goes before her husband, King Xerxes, which is kind of a unique position of influence. But when the Jewish people there's been this decree that they will face a genocide, she risks a lot by going before and advocating for herself and for her people. Nehemiah likewise goes before King Artaxerxes. He's his cupbearer, and I love how in that passage in Nehemiah 2, he prays to the Lord, and then he goes and says, "This is what I need you to do," and shows a real boldness. It's probably worth mentioning also. There's no guarantee biblically that advocacy will work. John the Baptist confronted a governing authority as well, and King Herod, when he was doing unjust and immoral things, and he was beheaded. Very few Americans are likely to face that consequence when we advocate. We have brothers and sisters in Christ in other parts of the world who could face that sort of consequence when they speak up against unjust policies in their countries of origin. In the US, though, there are costs to count sometimes for advocating for those who are vulnerable. It may not please everyone. For churches, there may be some angry emails for a pastor who speaks into this issue. Certainly, we've experienced that at World Relief, but we really believe that our call is to speak up for justice. And part of that is really calling our members of Congress, our senators, to their responsibility. I love this passage in Proverbs chapter 3. It says, "Do not withhold good from those to whom it is due when it is in your power to act. Do not say to your neighbor, 'Come back tomorrow, and I'll give it to you,' when you already have it with you." And it's been so frustrating to see Congress sort of kick this policy discussion down the road one time after another for literally decades at this point. I was saying, well, we'll solve that later. We really believe that this needs to be solved now. And the urgency of the court decision out of Texas really underscores. We don't need to wait for a higher court to rule on this or for the Supreme Court. We need Congress to take action now. And so Congress should not withhold good from those to whom it is due. It is in their power to act. But in a secondary way, it is also in our power to act, because we have the authority and the privilege to reach out to our elected officials, to call them, to send them letters, to make sure that they know what we think. And we really have seen that makes a difference. So I wanted to plug this tool that we've put together at the Evangelical Immigration Table. We call it, drawing on Proverbs 3, the Power to Act Challenge, really challenging Christians in particular to use their power to act, to not defer that to another day, but to do it today and to do it regularly. So we've got this tool on our website, and I think we can even put this in the chat, but it's just evangelicalimmigrationtable.com/unmute. You'll see a cute little video there that you'll see why we call it. It's /unmute. But we've made this as simple as we possibly can. If you enter your basic information there, and this is not so that we can harass you at your home address, but so that we know who your senators are, who your member of Congress is. You enter that in, and then very simply, you click the button, call my senators, it will actually call you. So I know there's some millennials listening probably who don't know how to dial a phone number. I'm with you there. It's not something we do very often, but it will call you and you click the green button and say hello. You actually hear my voice recorded saying, hey, we're going to be connected to your senator. So if you're in Pennsylvania, to Senator Toomey, and then Senator Casey. And the message isn't complicated. It's basically, we need a permanent solution for Dreamers. And if you're comfortable, you can share why that's important to you, especially as a Christian. And then if you press the star key, it'll then connect you to your next senator's office. So you can actually do both senators in one call. It's not complicated. You'll very likely leave a voicemail, especially with kind of the COVID dynamics right now, or you may speak to an intern who will answer the phone. They're very nice. Their job is to be nice to you. I promise they won't insult you or anything like that. But those advocacy actions really do make a difference, because when when a senator hears from his or her constituents, they take that as a reading on how people are going to vote when it comes time for re-election. And they, most of them are pretty self-interested in their own re-election. The reality is that the vast majority of Americans, the vast majority of evangelical Christians, the majority of Republicans, the majority of Democrats all support a permanent solution for Dreamers to allow them to apply for citizenship. But it is just something that the Congress has yet to act on. And I should say the House of Representatives has taken action. That's part of a bill that passed a few months ago. The Senate has a bill pending. Senator Graham from South Carolina and Senator Durbin from Illinois have their current version of the DREAM Act, but it hasn't gone through committee yet and it hasn't passed into law. There's other efforts to include that in some of the budget bills. So there's a few ways that this could happen going forward. But our hope would be that both of Pennsylvania senators would be active in advocating for Dreamers. So we'd really encourage you to reach out and ask them to do so. And with that, well, I wanted to close with this quote because I find it kind of interesting and especially for Christians. First of all, this quote from President Reagan from 1989 from his farewell address to the nation. President Reagan said this: "I've thought a bit of the shining city upon a hill. In my mind, it was a tall, proud city built on rocks stronger than oceans, wind swept, God blessed, and teeming with people of all kinds living in harmony and peace. And if there had to be city walls, the walls had doors, and the doors were open to anyone with the will and the heart to get here." Now, I like that quote because it sort of roughly describes the sort of immigration policy that I would like the United States to return to. But I think it's important to quibble a little bit with President Reagan. Elsewhere in this speech, he credits that phrase, "a city upon a hill," to the early Puritan colonist John Winthrop, who did use that term, of course, but it didn't originate with John Winthrop. If you know your Bibles, you know that phrase, "a city on a hill," comes from Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5. And Jesus was not talking to the United States of America. He wasn't talking about any particular policy. He was talking to the church, to his earliest disciples. And he said this: "You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who's in heaven." There are probably a couple million Dreamers in this country at this point, and many of them are already brothers and sisters in Christ who are members of local churches. Many others are not. They don't know what to think about Jesus, but frankly, many of them are forming their opinions of Jesus on the responses to this dynamic from people who profess to be his followers, whether that is a response of hospitality and advocacy, or it is one of apathy or even hostility. And my prayer is that the church would really be outspoken in advocating with and for Dreamers, and doing so in a way that ultimately our Father in heaven would be glorified. So with that, I think we can have Ivana and Christy come back. And I don't know if we have any questions, but if we do, or Christy, if you have any questions, or however you want to do this, Christy, you're in charge.
Yeah. So I had a question to get us started. If anyone else wants to add questions, at the bottom of your screen, there's a little button that says Q&A. Feel free to drop them in there. But my question is for Ivana, not to put you on the spot, but what is something you would like those who are not Dreamers to know? Like if you could communicate to your wider American family, know this about us, and, what would you want to say? Maybe it's an education thing, or maybe it's an exhortation.
Yeah. I'd say, going off kind of what Matt had, we're humans. We belong, we're important, we care, and we really have an amazing community that we really want to uplift and support one another. And I think that I want other Americans to know that we really are here because we're looking for better opportunities. We're making sure not just better opportunities, but safety for our family, children, and also our elders. And so making sure that they know that we're here, wonderful, amazing people, and we're really looking for the best, not just for ourselves, but for everyone around us.
All right. Thank you. That is really, really helpful. I'm trying to pull up questions in the chat at the same time. I think that empathy is something that we all need to turn our brains on a little more. Matt, what would you say would help people have more confidence that their elected officials will listen? So I find one of the things that people don't, they don't contact their senators, or they don't contact their member of Congress, is they just think, well, nothing matters, it doesn't work. Would you have any encouragement for those who are feeling really lethargic, like it doesn't feel like my voice matters? Like, why could this really make a difference for dreamers in this country?
Yeah, I mean, I think that sort of becomes this vicious cycle where it doesn't make a difference because we don't do it. And frankly, the opposition to this is very well organized. They're not most Americans, if you look at the polling, but they're very persistent. They make phone calls over and over and over again, and almost exhaust congressional offices. But those congressional offices then understand that, wow, this is a key issue that these people are going to vote on. Because it may be that 70% of Americans support a solution for dreamers, but the hard reality is they don't see a lot of evidence in Congress that this is the make or break issue for most voters. For those for whom it is probably most important can't vote. I mean, that's the hard reality, though they certainly have, loved ones who can in many cases. So I think, I've seen advocacy work on occasion. It's, probably the clearest example for me was back in 2018. I was on Capitol Hill for a World Refugee Day event where we brought a bunch of pastors to Washington, and we're meeting and talking about refugee issues. But it just so happened that was just when the news was breaking about children being separated from their parents at the border. And that was an administrative policy. It wasn't the Congress that had passed a new law to make that happen, but people were calling their members of Congress about it. And I was in, a whole bunch of different congressional offices that particular day. I think it was World Refugee Day. It was June 20th, I think. And I only heard one side of the conversation, but it would be basically, oh no, my boss is definitely against tearing children apart from their parents. Oh no, we're definitely against the family separation thing. And that was both Republicans and Democrats. And apparently they got the word to the White House that, especially I think on the Republican side, because this was when a Republican president was in office. Hey, you're hurting us politically with this policy. The people don't like it, and we can't back you up on this. And President Trump, who just a few days earlier had sort of said, it's just me enforcing the law, there's nothing I can do about this, signed an executive order saying, oh, we're not going to do that anymore. And not that it fully stopped in every case, but it largely stopped because of that advocacy that happened. And if there would be a similar outpouring of phone calls to Congress now, I think it would really encourage the senators to say, wow, this is something that there's support for. And frankly, a lot of senators are looking not just for support, they're looking for cover. They already want to do this. Only a few of them actually think this is the wrong thing to do. The significant majority understand that from an economic perspective and just a basic humanitarian perspective. Many of them are Christians themselves who are looking at this from a faith perspective. They would love to be able to vote for something like the DREAM Act. They really would not like to lose their seat in a primary election over that vote. So for them to know that there's broad support, and I think especially from evangelical Christians, is really important. And that's why those phone calls are so vital.
My 2 cents, I wish they would be willing to lose their seat over this, because that is doing the right thing. But yes, I think, for the public to show their support, many of them need that. And so that's why we push them. So that's great. I don't know if I see any other questions coming in the chat. So with that, if not, I will finish us and sign us off. Ivana, thank you so much for your story and for being with us and sharing. And I'm so grateful to have you impacting our higher education. I've always had great respect for the University of Michigan, so I'm glad they got you over there, although I'm sure Penn State and some of your big Pennsylvania universities have a little rivalry going on there. And Matt, thank you so much for helping us with some of that like technical stuff, as well as a theological foundation. Really appreciate that. We will follow folks up with an email, and that will have this link it'll be on YouTube somewhere that you are welcome to share. And we'll also make sure we have some of those advocacy links. If you have further questions, feel free to reach out to me. And if you have a particular church or your community, or even your local town council wants to talk more about Dreamers, we would love to set up an event for you. So feel free to reach out about that. But thank you so much, everyone. It's been a pleasure being with you all today.